Hello everyone, this is Dude Blender, and let's jump right in. I will assume in this video that you know your way around Blender. You know how to move, scale, rotate things, navigate around the 3D space, and in general have a working knowledge of Blender. This is not a first time you use Blender video, so keep that in mind. I basically started this channel to be able to make this series. I'm passionate about 3D animation and what you can do with it. I actually visited the offices of Disney Studios and Pixar, and I had a chance to work with them for a while, so there's a lot of stuff that I want to share. Also, make no mistake, Blender is very powerful and you can do professional work with it, ads, or even a short film if you want it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Animation is a huge subject, so in this video we'll be talking about the very basics of 3D keyframe animation. We'll do this simple sphere animation, focusing on understanding what we're doing, because this is an area where we need to have strong foundations. So animation is creating the illusion of movement by making small changes each frame. Then, when you play them one after the other, we interpret that as movement, a frame referring to each of the static images that make up your animation. The term keyframe dates back to the times of Walt Disney. Movies and shorts used to require 24 frames per second, and each frame was drawn by hand. It was very expensive to have these senior animators to do all of this work, so they would draw only the frames that defined the action, or the keyframes, and then more junior animators would draw the frames that were between the keyframes. They were called in-betweeners, or tweeners for short, and they were talented artists on their own right. Keyframes would also usually include notes instructing the tweeners on how to draw those frames. The process is similar today with 3D animation. You only need to set the keyframes, tell Blender how to interpolate the in-betweens, and let it calculate those. Let's do a warm-up. We're gonna animate two objects. So create a cube and an icosphere, or any two objects that you want, and place them next to each other. We need to set only two keyframes, the first and the last. In Blender you can animate almost any field, which is seriously cool. So color, shape, even material can be animated, and it's always the same process. Open this panel by pressing N or clicking on this arrow, and make sure that you're in the item tab. Select the cube and place it on the initial position. I'm just gonna leave it there. Now back in the item tab, hover the mouse over the field that you want to animate, in this case it's a location, and press I on your keyboard. You'll see that the field changes color, and you'll be able to see one or two rhombuses here in the timeline. Those are the visual cues that you've placed a keyframe. Now advance 20 or so frames in the timeline and place your cube in the final position. Now hover in the location field again and press I. Now go back to the first frame by pressing Shift left arrow or this button. Press spacebar or this play button, and you'll see the cube moving between the initial and final positions. Press spacebar again to stop the animation. If you let it run, it will repeat over and over again. Now let's rotate the icosphere one full turn. Back to frame 1, select the icosphere, and you'll note that the keyframes are no longer shown in the timeline. The timeline will only show the keyframes of the objects that you have selected. Create a rotation keyframe. Go to the same place where you place the keyframe in the other object, rotate the icosphere in Z 360 degrees, and create a keyframe. Press spacebar, and now you'll be able to see both objects moving. Now we have two objects, each with their own animations, and there are a few things to learn at this point. If you select both objects, you'll see where there are keyframes on any of the objects that you've selected. Expand this window with this arrow if you haven't done so already. I'm gonna make this panel bigger. You'll be able to see all of the properties that are being animated in both objects. If you expand these further, you'll see all of the dimensions of the properties that you're animating. You'll see lines connecting keyframes when nothing is changing in that period of time. So for example, since we only rotated the icosphere around the z-axis, x and y don't change. The navigation in the timeline is almost the same as in the 3D viewport. You can click and drag the middle mouse button to move around, and control middle mouse button and drag to zoom in and out. Other common shortcuts also apply here. A selects everything. Yellow keyframes are selected. Double A deselects. Gray keyframes are deselected. G grabs the selected keyframes and allows you to move them along the timeline. S scales around the current frame. X allows you to delete keyframes. Shift-D duplicates the selected keyframes, and you can press R to change the color of the keyframes. Finally, you should learn M to add a marker, and when you have it selected, F2 to change the name also applies here. Whenever you are on a marked frame, the text info will show so here. Now, one more thing about the timeline. As you start animating other properties of the object, this might get very crowded. The search bar here allows you to quickly filter what information you want to see, and this doubled arrow inverts the search. So for example, if I just wanted to see the Z location, I could just type Z and everything else disappears. And if I just wanted to hide the Z location, I would press this button, and now you can see the X and Y locations. Now, while the timeline allows you to very quickly move your keyframes around, the graph editor gives you control of how the in-between frames are interpolated. You can control tab to toggle between the timeline and the graph editor. Let's filter the cube's Z location to work on it. This is called an F-curve, and it shows the value that the animated property is taking in each frame. If you press N or click on this arrow, you'll see this panel. When you select a curve, you'll see more information about that curve on the F-curve tab. If I select a keyframe, it will show the interpolation method that Blender is using to calculate the in-between frames, what frame it's on, and what value it has on that frame. You can tweak the animation right here on the chart. I can change the value in the field or move the keyframe, and you'll see that the object moves also in the 3D viewport as well as the information of the transform. By default, Blender uses a Bezier interpolation method. If you select a keyframe and press T, you can see different interpolation methods that can be used towards the next keyframe. And you can adjust the parameters on this side panel where it applies. So for example, if I wanted to apply a bounce effect, even though the cube is moving up, I could select the keyframe, press T, and select bounce. Now, if I play the animation, you can see the effect. Try different ones to get a feeling of what each method does. So that's a basic theory. Now let's apply it by doing this jumping ball, which is actually more nuanced than it might look. Clear everything in your scene and add a cube with a level 2 subdivision modifier. Apply it, then add a cast modifier to sphere, factor 1, and apply that too with Ctrl A. We're gonna make use of a few of the principles of animation as explained in this treasure of a book, The Illusion of Life. We'll use squash and stretch, anticipation, and follow through. So instead of having our sphere just make the movement, we're gonna have it prepare it, deform during the action, and react after the action has been executed to make for a richer animation. This is a classic Hanna-Barbera example of these principles where Snagglepuss prepares the movement. In fact, he verbalizes what he's about to do, exit stage left, does the action, and then follows through by getting his shadow. To simplify things a bit, we'll just move the sphere in the X and Z dimensions. With the sphere selected, go to Object Data Properties and add 3 shape keys. Rename the last 2 squash and stretch. We're not gonna rig the sphere as that's a whole other science, and I'll leave that for another video in the series. We'll use shape keys instead. With the squash shape key selected, tab into edit mode and squash the sphere on the Z axis as much as you want. We want to squash it down on the Z axis towards the base, so it's easier to place the 3D cursor on the base of the sphere and change the transform pivot point to 3D cursor. You can even scale it a little bit sideways to account for that mass of the squash. Now tab out, change the pivot point back to bounding box center, and stretch the sphere in the stretch shape key. Remember to constrain only to the Z axis. We're gonna be animating the shape key values as well as the position and the rotation of the sphere. Alright, let's begin. We're gonna leave a few frames for the anticipation part of the animation. So we'll start on frame 20. Let's add a location keyframe. Now advance 20 frames or so in the timeline and place the sphere in the highest point of the jump. Add a new location keyframe. Then advance the same number of keyframes and place the sphere in its final position. Zero the Z location to keep it aligned to the plane where it began. Now place a new keyframe. Now we can play the animation to get a feeling of the pace and adjust anything about this base animation. Once you're happy with this base, I strongly suggest that you add markers for the start, peak, and end frames. Now on the graph editor, we'll adjust the ZF curve to make the movement look more realistic. The sphere should move faster at the beginning and at the end of the jump, and slower at the top. So let's select this keyframe and stretch it with S. If necessary, you can also adjust the height of the jump jump directly here on the graph editor. I will do that since my animation doesn't look very realistic. Also move the handles of the first and last keyframes to get a movement that you feel is better. Test out your animation often. This is where your personal style will start to show. Now let's go to the X F-curve. Since the sphere would move at a constant speed in the X direction during a jump, we want to have a linear interpolation in this F-curve. Select everything with A, press T, and select linear. Now play your animation again and tweak the F-curves until you're satisfied with the movement. My curves ended up looking like this. Remember that you can grab keyframes with G and constrain the movement to the X or Y axis in the graph editor. If you moved your keyframes in the timeline, remember to readjust your markers as well. Now let's add the personality of our character. Before the jump, the sphere will squash. This not only adds more character to the sphere, but it also cues the audience that something is about to happen. So go to the first frame and add a keyframe of the value of the squash. Add one more a few frames before the actual jump and one more at the moment of the start. The shape key values can only take numbers between 0 to 1. If you go beyond those values, no big deal, Blender will just clamp them. Now grab the second keyframe that you created and move it up to the value of 1. Play the animation and adjust the F-curve until you feel that the movement looks natural. You can get creative. Maybe the sphere counts to 3 before jumping, maybe it squishes for a longer time. Here's where you can express your creative self, and these subtle adjustments do make a difference. My curve ended up looking like this. I used a bounce interpolation after the jump as a follow-through. Now let's do the stretch. The sphere should stretch at the beginning and end of the jump and have a normal shape at the peak. Same process, add a keyframe at the beginning and end of the jump. I'm gonna filter here so that I only see the stretch curve. And add one more keyframe at the peak of the jump. Now move the side keyframes up and play the animation to see how it looks. I think it looks okay. I'm going to stretch this a little bit and I'm going to add one more keyframe at the beginning and at the end to reset the shape. This is how my curve ended up looking, but as I always say, you do you. Finally, let's rotate the sphere so that the stretch is always pointing in the direction of the movement. Go to the jump start frame and add a rotation keyframe on the sphere. Add one more on the peak. Let's just filter YEU to filter out the Y Euler rotation, which is the one that we'll be working with. Now we'll need to scale this down because the rotation is in degrees and we need to rotate this around 45 to 50 degrees. So move this peak keyframe up around 40, 45 or 50 degrees. And now let's play the animation. It looks okay, we just need to tweak this a little bit more. I think the first part of the jump looks good now. Now we need the rotation for the second part of the jump. Here we need to add a third keyframe. I'm just gonna duplicate this and move it around negative 45 or 50, something around that. Now on the end keyframe, I'm going to change the rotation to 0 and add one more keyframe. I'll adjust this handle and play the animation again. And now I think it's looking pretty good. This is how my curve ended up looking. You'll see that it's not perfect. This curve is not the exact same shape as this curve. The positive rotation goes all the way up to 50, but the negative rotation is on minus 37 degrees. And this is also part of what your style is. Is it mathematically and scientifically perfect, or is it more artistic and you kind of eyeball it? Those decisions are the ones that are going to make your very own animation style. So experiment and start from the base that there's really no right or wrong answers. Now you can add a plane, background, materials, or even a scene of a chasm or a pool or a cave or whatever you want to make your final animation, and a little bit of editing and sound can look something like this. That's it for today. Drop a like, comment, and subscribe if you liked the video, and connect with me on TikTok and Instagram with the handle @dude_blender. I'm Dude Blender. Happy blending. And don't forget to check out these other videos in the channel. Everything is top notch, guaranteed.